The town of Raven's Peak was never the same after the night the stars went out. Folks woke up to find the sky as black as coal, not a single twinkling light to guide them through the darkness. It was as if the heavens themselves had been extinguished, plunging the world into an eternal midnight. At first, nobody paid much mind to the strange occurrence. After all, the townsfolk of Raven's Peak were a hardy bunch, accustomed to the whims of the wilderness. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the absence of starlight began to take its toll. Crops withered and died, livestock fell ill, and the once clear streams ran murky and foul. It was then that the whispers started. Whispers of an ancient evil, awakened by the extinction of the stars. Whispers of a creature that roamed the shadows, its presence felt in the creaking of trees and the hooting of owls. They called it the Devourer of Light, a being from a time before time, when the universe was still young and malleable. In the midst of this growing unease, a stranger arrived in town. He was a tall, gaunt figure with eyes like two holes burned into the fabric of reality. His name was Mr. Blackwood, and he wore a black suit that seemed to absorb the faint candlelight that flickered in the windows of the Raven's Peak Saloon. Mr. Blackwood's presence was as inconspicuous as a ghost, yet it drew the attention of every soul in the saloon. He ordered a whiskey, his voice low and smooth as a summer breeze, and took a seat at the far end of the bar, his eyes scanning the room with an unnerving intensity. The patrons exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that this stranger was not one to be trifled with. As the night wore on, the whispers about the Devourer of Light grew louder, and Mr. Blackwood's interest seemed to peak. He listened intently to the hushed tales of the creature's supposed appearances, the way it seemed to draw the very light out of the air, leaving only darkness and despair in its wake. A lone figure, a young woman named Emily, approached Mr. Blackwood, her eyes gleaming with a mix of fear and determination. She spoke in hushed tones, her words barely audible over the crackling of the fire, but Mr. Blackwood's ears seemed to pick up every syllable. His eyes narrowed, his gaze piercing, as if he could see right through to the heart of the matter. "I've seen it, sir," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "The Devourer of Light took my sister, Rebecca. It took her in the dead of night, when the stars were supposed to be shining bright. I know it'll come for me next, sir. I can feel it watching, waiting." Mr. Blackwood's expression remained unreadable, but his words sent a shiver down Emily's spine. "Tell me, child," he said, his voice dripping with an unsettling calm. "What did this creature look like, exactly?" Emily's eyes darted around the room, as if she feared being overheard by unseen listeners. "It was tall, sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Taller than the tallest tree in the forest. Its body was like a shadow, all dark and formless, with eyes that glowed like embers from the underworld. And its touch was like a winter wind that cuts to the bone." Mr. Blackwood's gaze did not waver, his eyes fixed on Emily with an unnerving intensity. "Go on," he urged, his voice low and smooth as silk. Emily's words spilled out in a rush, as if she was desperate to unburden herself of the horror. "It came for Rebecca on a night just like any other. I heard her scream, but by the time I got to her, she was different. Her eyes were black as coal, and her skin was as cold as the grave. She wasn't my sister anymore, sir. She was something else." Mr. Blackwood's expression remained unreadable, but his eyes seemed to bore deeper into Emily's soul. "And what happened to your sister after that?" he asked, his voice like a gentle breeze that sent shivers down the spine. Emily's voice dropped to a whisper, her words barely audible over the crackling of the fire. "She disappeared, sir, into the darkness, and I've seen her since, lurking at the edge of town, her eyes glowing like embers in the night. I know the Devourer of Light is waiting for me, sir. I can feel its presence, watching and waiting." As Emily's words trailed off, the fire in the hearth seemed to flicker and dim, as if the very darkness itself was listening in on their conversation. Mr. Blackwood's gaze remained fixed on Emily, his eyes burning with an intensity that made her skin crawl. And in that moment, it was as if the very fate of Raven's Peak hung in the balance, suspended like a precarious thread between the darkness that lurked outside and the faint, flickering light that struggled to hold back the shadows. The air in the saloon seemed to thicken, like a pall of dread had settled over the patrons. Mr. Blackwood's eyes remained fixed on Emily, his gaze pinning her to her seat like a butterfly to a collector's board. The whispers and murmurs of the crowd died down, replaced by an oppressive silence that hung heavy as a physical presence. Slowly, Mr. Blackwood's hand emerged from the shadows of his coat, his long fingers closing around a small, intricately carved box. The box itself seemed to absorb the dim light around it, radiating an aura of foreboding. Emily's eyes widened as Mr. Blackwood's hand opened, revealing the box's contents. A small, glowing orb that pulsed with a faint, otherworldly light. "This is a star heart," Mr. Blackwood announced, his voice low and hypnotic, a fragment of the celestial essence that once lit the skies. "It is said to hold the power to banish the Devourer of Light, to restore the stars to their rightful place in the heavens." The patrons of the saloon exchanged uneasy glances, unsure what to make of Mr. Blackwood's claims. Emily's eyes, however, remained fixed on the glowing orb, a spark of hope flickering to life within her. "What do you want from me, sir?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Blackwood's smile was a thin, mirthless thing, a mere rictus of lips that seemed to hide a deeper, darker purpose. "I want you to take me to the place where your sister was taken," he said, his voice dripping with an unholy enthusiasm. "I want to show the Devourer of Light the true meaning of darkness." As Mr. Blackwood's words hung in the air, the fire in the hearth seemed to flicker and dance, casting twisted shadows on the walls of the saloon. The patrons of Raven's Peak Saloon exchanged nervous glances, sensing that they were about to embark on a journey into the very heart of madness itself. The night air was heavy with an unspoken threat as Emily led Mr. Blackwood out of the saloon, the patrons watching them depart with a mix of fascination and trepidation. The darkness seemed to swirl around them, like a living entity that wrapped itself around their ankles, pulling them deeper into the shadows. As they walked, the silence between them grew thicker, like a palpable mist that hung in the air. Emily's footsteps echoed through the deserted streets, the only sound in a world that seemed to be holding its breath. Mr. Blackwood's long strides devoured the distance, his eyes fixed on some point ahead, his face a mask of determination. They finally stopped at the edge of town, where the forest loomed like a dark, primeval entity, its branches creaking ominously in the wind. Emily's voice was barely above a whisper as she pointed into the darkness. "It was there, sir. That's where I last saw Rebecca, where the Devourer of Light took her." Mr. Blackwood's gaze locked onto the spot, his eyes burning with an unnatural intensity. For a moment, Emily thought she saw his pupils dilate, like a cat's eyes in the dark, drinking in the shadows. And then, with a fluid motion, he reached into his coat and produced a small, ornate lantern. The glass was etched with strange symbols that seemed to shimmer, as if they were alive. "This is a lantern of the Luminari," Mr. Blackwood whispered, his voice like a sigh on the wind. "It will guide us through the darkness and illuminate the path to the Devourer of Light." As he lit the lantern, a warm, golden glow spilled out, casting an eerie light on the surrounding trees. The shadows seemed to recoil, as if burned by the radiance. Emily felt a spark of hope ignite within her, a sense that maybe, just maybe, they could defeat the monster that lurked in the darkness. But as they stepped into the forest, the trees seemed to close in around them, their branches tangling above like skeletal fingers. Emily's heart began to race, her breath coming in short gasps. She knew that they were walking into the very heart of terror itself, and that the darkness would not give up its secrets without a fight. The lantern's warm glow cast eerie shadows on the trees, making it seem as if the forest itself was watching them. Emily's nerves were stretched taut, her senses heightened as she walked beside Mr. Blackwood. The silence between them was no longer comfortable, but oppressive, like a weight that pressed down on her chest. As they delved deeper into the forest, the trees grew twisted and gnarled, their branches like bony fingers reaching out to snare them. The air was heavy with the scent of decay and rot, and Emily's stomach churned with every step. She felt like she was being pulled into a nightmare from which she might never awaken. Suddenly, Mr. Blackwood stopped, his head cocked to one side. Emily froze, her heart pounding in her chest. "What is it, sir?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mr. Blackwood's eyes were fixed on something ahead, his gaze piercing the darkness. "We're close," he whispered, his voice low and deadly. "I can feel it. The Devourer of Light is near." Emily's skin crawled as she peered into the darkness, her eyes straining to see what Mr. Blackwood saw. And then, she felt it too, a presence that seemed to permeate the air. A heavy, oppressive weight that crushed the breath from her lungs. The lantern's flame flickered, casting eerie shadows on the trees. Emily's heart raced as she realized they were being watched, that the darkness itself was coalescing into a presence that loomed before them. And then, out of the corner of her eye, Emily saw it, a figure that towered over them, its body a dark, amorphous mass that seemed to absorb the light around it. The air seemed to distort and ripple around it, as if reality itself was bending to accommodate its presence. "The Devourer of Light," Mr. Blackwood whispered, his voice full of awe and terror. "We've found it." Emily's scream was frozen in her throat as the creature began to move towards them, its presence washing over them like a cold, dark wave.